Everyone, this is Sue Watkins, the Climate Change Program Manager with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals at Northern Arizona University. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. This webinar series is exploring climate change in the Pacific Northwest and impacts of tribes in the region. We're offering the webinars with support from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and in collaboration with the research station, the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon and the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Next slide, Christina. Okay, so today's webinar will focus on climate change impacts on fisheries in the Pacific Northwest, and it features presentations by Tim Beachy with NOAA and Kyle Dittmer with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. The May 21st webinar will be about climate change and marine issues, including sea level rise, ocean acidification, and the effects of water temperature on disease processes. The May 27th webinar will focus on climate change, pests in forest ecosystems, especially bark beetles, and invasive species in freshwater ecosystems. And the last webinar, scheduled for June 4th, will focus on climate change impacts on forests in the Pacific Northwest. This webinar is being recorded, and the presentation will be posted on ITEP's Climate Change Webinars webpage. The URL is on this slide. Please type your questions into the chat box on the right side of your screen. The presenters will answer questions following the two presentations. Also, please mute your lines to reduce any distracting background noise. Following the webinar, you will receive a link to a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback and suggestions of topics for future webinars. Next slide, Christina. Here's the contact information for me and Christina Gonzalez-Maddox, who is helping me with the webinar and works with me in the climate change program. ITEP's climate change program offers trainings on climate change adaptation planning, webinars, tribal climate change newsletter, and the Tribes and Climate Change website, and much more. We encourage you all to visit ITEP's climate change program website at the URL listed on this slide. And please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about ITEP. We're very pleased to have Tim Beachy and Kyle Dittmer with us this morning for the first webinar in the series. And so, Christina, why don't you and Tim work on switching the slides to his view?
You bet.
And while you do that, I will introduce Tim. Tim Beachy is the Fisheries Supervisory Research Fish Biologist with NOAA Fisheries. He has worked at the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center since 1999 and is currently the leader of the Ecosystem Processes Research Team in the Watershed Program. His research focuses on geomorphology and riparian vegetation as key drivers of riverine ecosystems. Tim holds a bachelor's degree in geology, a master's degree in fisheries, and a PhD in forest hydrology, all from the University of Washington in Seattle. His current research interests include influences of valley and river morphology on salmon habitats and populations, using land use and restoration scenarios to estimate salmon population responses and evaluate restoration alternatives, and adapting river restoration plans and project designs for climate change. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Tim at this point.
I think, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, there we go. So, thank you, Sue and Christina, for the invitation. I'm going to go through a fairly simple presentation today on climate change. Whoops. temperature that the models are telling us to expect in the Pacific Northwest. And then I will go through some fish population vulnerability assessments that we and others have been working on. And in that part of the talk, we'll go through how we think about assessing vulnerability, what are the components of it, and then show a few examples of how we're working on assessing vulnerability. So to start with, the climate change models. So there's a series of models that we use, most of which we don't do the modeling for. So that the basic data that we use are from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and they produce all of the emissions scenarios and the 21 or 22 climate models that that run on top of those emission scenarios. And there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, since we're trying to predict the future. And some of the uncertainty comes from our lack of knowledge of what the future is going to be like for these different climate scenarios. So these are emission scenarios. Here's the B1, the A1B, the A2. These are pretty common ones. And you can see that depending on how things go, we can end up in a very different place, especially the farther out we get. If we're more in the middle here around 2050, the models aren't that different from each other. So the near future, a little less uncertainty from the climate scenarios, but much more uncertainty as we go farther out into the future. On top of that, so that was the first part. On top of that, we have the models. So these are the range of outputs we get from the different climate models in terms of temperature increase. So we have this emission scenario for A1B, for example, and then there's 20 or so different models that they run to make predictions about what that means for atmospheric temperature and precipitation. And so I don't know what this is doing, but I'll just keep clicking it off. And so you can see that there's uncertainty there. So we have this uncertainty of a couple degrees from the climate scenarios and then another couple degrees on each of those from the models. And so overall we're typically looking at a range of 4 to 5 degrees in where we might end up in the future. So on top of that, we add downscaling uncertainty and hydrologic model uncertainty. So here's just a simple schematic of how the modeling works. So the global climate simulations are at a 1/2 to 2 degree resolution, meaning each grid cell on the planet has a size of 50 to 250 kilometers on a side. So they're very large cells, and for each cell we get one temperature data point and one precipitation data point. So the global models are running at a very coarse resolution. What they do with that is downscale it, and that's taking each cell and breaking it up into multiple cells to reflect better what's going on with the orographic and local circulation patterns. And so we end up with cells that are 6 to 12 kilometers on a side. So it's taking one of those large cells that might have, say, a temperature of 6 degrees and breaking it up into 60 cells that have a bunch of different temperatures depending on where they are with respect to elevation and altitude or elevation and aspect, and but that those 60 cells still have the same average temperature as the cell that they come from. It's trying to advance here. Oh, my computer is freezing up. There we go. So we have air temperature and precipitation coming out of that at these grid cells, and then that goes into a hydrologic model which adds its own layers of uncertainty, and that produces daily stream flow and temperature. And so on the surface this looks like pretty good information, but you have to remember that even for a stream flow data point, it'll give us a CFS, a discharge amount, but that is still for a 6 kilometer on a side chunk of land. So it's not actually a stream, it's a big piece of the landscape to get one average stream flow value. So just remember as we go through all of this that these predictions are there, and they might look good when you make a big map out of them, but they're very coarse resolution still, and there's a lot of uncertainty around each value. So here's some examples of predicted change. So here's predicted change in low flow around the Pacific Northwest. This is the lowest monthly flow, and you can see the red zones here are the areas that are 35 to 75% decrease. And they tend to be mostly where we're losing a lot of snowpack. So in this case, what's happening is we're losing the snowpack, and so by the time you get to spring and summer, there's just less water getting to the stream. And then there's areas that have less snowpack to begin with, and so their decreases are smaller. That's this 10 to 35% area. And then there's some areas that actually increase, and so here the upper portion is up in Canada, and that increases because even though it's getting a little bit warmer, it's still really cold up there, and so there's plenty of snow, and the precipitation is increasing a little bit, so they actually get an increase in snowpack. And then there's a fair amount of the area where the models don't really predict any change. So you can see that it's not the same everywhere. So even though we're getting the same sort of average increase in temperature, it has different effects on the stream flow depending on where you are in the landscape. So that today we tend to analyze our hydrographs in terms of hydrologic regime. So here's 4 examples of the basic ones. The snowmelt regime in the upper left up here. And so that regime, the precipitation is coming off during this one time period, you know, fall and winter, or falling during this time period, and it falls as snow. So we don't really get any boost in the runoff until we get to the spring when everything is melting. And that contrasts with a rainfall-dominated one like the Mattole River in California, where there is no snow for all practical purposes, and when it rains, it floods. And so the hydrograph looks pretty much like the precipitation period. And then we have transitional basins that have both a high elevation snowfall area of the basin and a low elevation rainfall part of the basin, and so they tend to get this double peak. So they get a rainfall peak and a snowmelt peak. And then there are some rivers like the Metolius River in Oregon that are groundwater fed, and so all of the precipitation goes deep into the fractured bedrock and then gets metered out very slowly, and so it doesn't respond much at all to precipitation. So these all have different effects on fisheries, which I won't go into detail on, meaning different effects on how salmon populations use these basins and how fast they grow and things like that. I won't go through all of that, but we'll just talk about a couple examples of how we use this in assessing climate change futures. So one of the things we want to know, because the different life history patterns of, for example, Chinook salmon are related to those different hydrologic regimes, we want to know how these are going to change across the landscape. And so here's a picture on the left of hydrologic regimes, pretty much what they look like today. So all the dark blue along the coastal area and the low elevation part of the interior Columbia Basin, which is here. These areas are rainfall, the highest elevation are snowmelt, and then a big part of the area in the northwest is this transitional or double peak. It has components of both the rainfall and the snowmelt. If we model that out into the future, we see that we lose a lot of snowpack and a huge part of the area becomes rainfall dominated. And one of the things we don't know yet is what this will mean for fish. So for example, within this area where it was transitional, it's dominated by stream-type Chinook salmon, whereas this area is dominated by ocean-type Chinook salmon. And if we turn all of this into this rainfall environment, we don't really know what that means for the stream-type Chinook. So it raises some questions, but it does give us an idea that there's going to be a pretty dramatic change in how water comes off the landscape. We can also look at temperature change. So here's the predicted temperature changes. On the left is the calibration period, or the historical period for the model. So this is model temperature for the 1970 to 99 period. And you see that looking at these thresholds here down in the lower right, if we're above 22 degrees, that's typically not very good for most salmon, at least at some life stages, although some are adapted to some of these high temperatures. And then if we're below 18 degrees, we're typically pretty good for most salmon. And you can see that even today, we have quite a few areas in the Columbia Basin where we're either at, near this threshold, which is the yellow, or above it, which is the oranges and reds. And then if we project into the future, we can see that more of the area becomes orange and red, and the yellow zone expands a bit as well. So we have more potential impact on fisheries. And again, there's some uncertainty here in the modeling, and then there's additional uncertainty from how the different salmon populations respond to this, because there's pretty good evidence now that salmon populations that are have evolved in warmer places tend to have higher thermal tolerances than salmon that are that have evolved in cooler places. So these thresholds aren't hard and fast. And these numbers that we produce from the model aren't necessarily certain either. And on top of that, if we look at this graph on the left, this is some data from Kushel et al. looking at current or recent trends in temperature across the U.S. And if you look at each of their pie charts here, the red areas indicate a significant positive trend. And even though we've had a clear warming trend in atmospheric temperatures during this time period, it doesn't necessarily get reflected in stream temperature in all locations. And so most of these places have less than half, except for the West, which has just over half of their study site locations having a significant positive trend. A few places in the blue having a negative trend, and a lot of them not having a significant trend at all. So even though we know that on average the whole globe is warming, it's not having the same effect everywhere. If we look at our model predictions, so this is the same temperature data that we showed you, except I'm just displaying the difference between those two time periods. And you can see that some parts of the basin are expected to have pretty large increases, whereas other parts of the basin, like the coastal zone, really aren't expected to have much temperature increase at all. So if you look at this and make some assumptions about how fish are adapted to the landscape, this is another way of sort of guesstimating how fish might respond. So if you're in the coast, even if you're somewhat near a thermal threshold today, you're not likely to cross it. Whereas in the interior, if you're near a thermal threshold and you're going to increase, say, 2 degrees instead of 1 degree, or even 3 degrees, you might increase, there's a much better chance that you're going to go over some thermal limits for at least some of the fish that are out there. So that is just a brief overview of some of what we know from the climate information. And as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty in all of that information. So what we like to try to summarize for people is what we can say and what we can't say. And what we cannot say is, for any particular reach, it's going to have a certain temperature, and we can predict what the discharge will be. We just don't have that much confidence in the models to do that. But we can say that on average stream temperatures will be warmer, meaning most places it looks like things will get warmer, and in some places significantly so. But from the current data that we have, or the recent trend data, the models are not necessarily predicting everything accurately at fine resolution. So there are some places that look like they may get cooler, even though the models are telling us they're going to get warmer. We don't really know where those are yet. And so there's that uncertainty to consider. On average, summer flows will be lower, and that's true in most of the Pacific Northwest, but higher in those few areas where we're going to have an increase in snowpack, or at least the models predict an increase in snowpack. And then probably the most confident thing, or the thing that we can be the most confident with, is that most snow-dominated regimes will shift towards rainfall-dominated, and that will shift the hydrograph peak earlier. So given all of that and the uncertainty, we still have the question of how vulnerable are these fish populations to climate change. And so we want to get at this box on the left of vulnerability. And it's really not just about the climate change. So our concept for this is that existing stresses reduce a fish's ability to respond to climate change. So what we mean by that is, for example, the population status has an influence on how on the capacity of a species or a population to respond to climate change. So if you have very few fish left and low diversity, then it doesn't have as much capacity to respond to a changing environment as a population that has lots of fish and a lot of life history diversity. So that's one aspect of it. We also have the habitat status, and so what we mean by this is if we've already impacted the habitat in a significant way by reducing stream flows or moving water from one basin to another basin, or removing riparian zones and increasing temperature, then that stress is already felt by the population, so they're already sort of pushed to the brink, and then we're going to add another climate change insult on top of that. So those two things sort of influence the sensitivity of a population to climate change, and then we add the climate change piece to evaluate the vulnerability. So if we look at some examples of existing habitat stresses, this is one kind of information that we use. And this is the human footprint index on the right, which is available for the whole planet and relatively consistent across the planet. And it's an index composed of a bunch of different metrics about population density, road density, impervious areas, things like that. And the pattern for North America is pretty much as you would expect. And then for the Northwest, what we did was take those data and pick apart the the different components and link them to known habitat degradation so that we could figure out which components of the index would be useful indicators of habitat stress for the Northwest. We also have the population stresses from various population status reviews in the big pictures. So this is for the whole range of salmon, and this is just an illustration for steelhead. The Atlas of Pacific Salmon that was put together by I'm forgetting who put it together, except I know Zan Ojiro was one of the lead authors of it. They did a review of all the populations for all the salmon species across the Pacific Rim, and here's the example for steelhead showing that basically in the lower 48, the Columbia River Basin here, and then down into California, things are not so good in terms of population status, meaning they're at high risk of extinction. And as you move north, it gets less and less so. And then over in Russia, it's kind of a mixed picture over there. So again, we can take these to more local data, and here's what we get for the habitat and population stress maps for steelhead in the Pacific Northwest. On the left is the habitat stress. So this again is composed of those indices that include things like population density and road density and agricultural land use, things like that that influence the status of the habitat in any particular place. And you see a relatively mixed picture, except there are a few areas where, for example, in the upper Salmon River Basin in Idaho or the upper Columbia in Canada, where there's less land use impact on the system. But if throughout most of the Pacific North range of Pacific salmon, it's a picture of moderate to pretty heavy alteration, except for a few minor spots like on the coast here of the Olympic Peninsula. If you look at the stock status stress, we did this one just based on their status level under the Endangered Species Act, and so the red ones are extirpated. These are places where we used to have salmon populations and don't right now. The yellow ones are threatened, in this case for steelhead. Within this zone there's also some endangered populations for other species. And then the green ones were either not warranted as listing, or were not warranted to be listed, or they are species of concern, meaning they weren't quite bad enough off to be listed, but there's something that we're keeping an eye on. And so these two components combine to give us an assessment of the sensitivity of populations. So this is for one species, across a very large area, meaning the whole Columbia River Basin and the coastal area of Oregon and Washington. We're also starting to try and look at how different species respond to the same template. So this is for the Skagit River, so a much smaller basin. It's only about 8,000 square kilometers, and we're looking at all the salmonid species in the basin and starting to get a sense of how they respond to the habitat stresses and population stresses. So here's an example for habitat. And a couple things you see from this is that some of these fish have white boxes, meaning they don't use those areas. Their life history, for example, for pink and chum doesn't depend very much on freshwater rearing or estuary rearing, so we don't rate those. So some of these species have a lot of sensitivities, some have less. So for example, the whitefish only have 4 boxes filled, so they're inherently a little bit less sensitive. And then you can also see, looking at the columns, that the near shore and the estuary and then a little bit of the freshwater are the ones that are the most impacted habitats, whereas the spawning and incubation is pretty much okay for most of the species. And then we aggregate those together to get a rating for some of these populations are high relative to their potential, meaning they're more sensitive to climate change because their habitats are impaired, and some are low, meaning they're less sensitive to climate change because their habitats are less impaired. So each species responds differently to the same habitat template out there today. We also look at the population stresses, and this is more of a yes-no, whereas the previous ones were ranked within each box. And this is just looking at abundance, the trend, spatial structure, genetic diversity, and life history diversity, and asking, are those impaired for each of these populations? So similar to the last slide, we're ranking each of those and then coming up with a summary call at the end. And you can see that many of these fish actually don't have much population stress, meaning they're in pretty good shape. And if you just look at the list, they tend to be the ones with less heavy fishing pressure and less hatchery influence. So the ones that have more fishing pressure and more hatchery influence tend to be the ones that have a higher population stress, meaning they're lower density, tend to have declining trends in most cases, and then may or may not have reduced diversity in spatial structure. So then those are the sensitivity elements, and now we want to look at the climate change effect on top of that. So the basic kinds of effects, here's some simple ones that are temperature related, so there might be influencing their bioenergetics and creating thermal barriers or egg viability and disease, things like that. And then there's flow effects, so you might have egg scour and burial. If your peak flows are going up, if your flows are going down, you might have reduced spawning habitat or low flow barriers, things like that. So we know that this sort of concept is how everything works. We have a set of climate change impacts on flow and temperature, and the life history has to overlay on that somehow. So this is how we think about it. We have this climate change effect template, so things like the temperature occur at a certain time of year, or the high temperature in this case. Low flow occurs at a certain time of year. Those tend to happen in this late summer period. Peak flows tend to happen in the fall in most of our areas in the Pacific Northwest. The spring melt is shifting, and that is in most of our areas typically in June, and then it's moving towards this March time frame. So that template is the same for all species. So now what we need to do is start laying species life histories on top of this and see how they interact with it. So here's an example for an ocean-type Chinook salmon. And you can see that at the return migration and spawning is where they're going to have to deal with temperature and low flow, so they might have some effects from that. Then they emerge in the winter, and then they go out as smolts fairly early in the spring, and so they don't really have to interact with this problem for any of their early life history stages, only for the spawning and returning adult stages. If we want to look at something with a longer freshwater life history, we just repeat this template for another year, so it's the same habitat template again, and then we overlay another life history type. So this one is the same species but different life history type, so they rear in freshwater for a longer time period, so they're going to get affected by this low flow and maybe some of the temperature, not only on the returning adult stage and spawning stage, but also during this early rearing phase. So just by their life history, they're exposed to more climate impacts than one that spends less time in freshwater. So this exposure is a big component of how we rate this climate change effect on fish. So here's some examples again, skipping over a lot of the details, but just going from that template that I just showed you through analyses of, for each life stage, how the temperature change is going to affect that life stage. And so we have, for example, what's the temperature stress on the returning adult, or the temperature stress on the egg incubation period, or the temperature stress on the freshwater rearing period. We have all of those temperature stresses sort of compressed into a single temperature index here, and the same for flow. There's a bunch of different flow components that we analyzed, and we end up layering those into a single flow stress indicator. So these are the two components that go into the vulnerability analysis for the steelhead, and you can see that the temperature stresses, probably as you would expect, are in the interior drier areas where it's hot, and then on the southern part of the coast, and less on the northern part of the coast or the northern part of the basin. Whereas the flow stresses are, as we noted earlier, often in these areas where we're losing snowpack. So some of this red, or most of this red, is where we're losing snowpack, and that's changing the flow regime. So we layer all of those together, and then we have, if we look at the key here at the bottom, the sensitivity component, which is here expressed as high, meaning there's a population or a habitat stress, or low, meaning there isn't a population or habitat stress. So the lighter colors are the lows and the darker colors are the highs. And then we have low exposure to any of those are greens, flow only is blue, temp only is red, flow and temperature both are purple. And so you can see that when we layer all of those together, pretty much all of these colors are dark, meaning that they almost all have a high population or habitat stress, except for a few, like this section on the coast of Washington, where we have a high exposure to flow change, but the populations aren't very stressed. So less sensitive, but still a big climate impact potential from the flow. Compare that to the interior, where we have both the habitat and population stresses existing, and we're in the dark color part of the range, and so we have a high temperature impact expected from climate change as well. And then there's relatively few areas where we have both the flow and temperature impact. So just a summary of some of these fisheries effects. A few key points that I think are worth noting. One is that some species are naturally more vulnerable than others, meaning they have more exposure to climate change effects, and that's simply because, as we pointed out, their life history is such that they encounter more of the changes as they go through each life stage. Some populations are more vulnerable than others, or I could say more sensitive here, so the ones that are smaller and have reduced diversity are more likely to be impacted by an additional insult from climate change because they're already sort of up against the wall, so to speak. And then some rivers are more vulnerable than others because they have more habitat stress and less habitat diversity. Obviously, if you looked at some of the hydrographs of our modified flows below dams, especially in California, you'd see that what we're predicting from climate change is really not a very significant change compared to what we've done by moving water around the landscape. For example, in many areas like the Trinity River, we take 90% of the water from the stream and move it over to a different basin entirely for irrigation. So some of those effects are really huge, and compared to climate change, they're much worse. So I will stop there. These are a few of the references that I mentioned along the way, or at least that were at the bottom of the slides. So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. That was a terrific presentation. If anyone has questions for Tim, please type them in the chat box. After the second presentation, we'll go through the questions and ask the presenters to address the questions. I think we're ready now to change the presenter. So while that's happening, changing over to Kyle, I will introduce Kyle. Kyle Dittmer earned 2 Bachelor of Science degrees in Geology and Oceanography from the University of Washington. He earned a Master's of Science degree in Geology College Instruction from Eastern Washington University. Kyle worked as a hydrologist for NOAA's National Weather Service in Portland for 10 years. In 1998, he joined the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. There he works as a hydrologist, meteorologist, and gives technical expertise to tribal salmon recovery projects. In 2003, after 14 years of study, Kyle was awarded a USDA Professional Certificate in Meteorology. He is the first and only certified meteorologist anywhere in Indian country. Kyle has taught part-time evening classes in introductory meteorology and introductory oceanography at Portland Community College since 1991. He has also been a science professor at Marlhurst University since 2006. He has published in the prestigious Journal of the American Water Resources Association. Kyle served as the president of the Oregon chapter of the American Meteorological Society from 2005 to 2009. The AMS is the largest professional weather organization in the world. Professor Dittmer's climate change work, changing stream flow on Columbia Basin tribal lands, climate change, and salmon, has been peer-reviewed and just published in the prestigious journal Climatic Change. The article is online and freely available. He is also a co-author for a group paper in the same journal titled Climate Change Impacts on the Water Resources of American Indians and Alaska Natives in the United States. With that, Kyle, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you sound great. Thanks, Kyle.
Okay, so the sound is good. The project I've been working on here, I've been doing actually, started 13 years ago, was actually a small project, and like a lot of these projects kind of took on a life on its own. I simply was going to document the actual climate change that has occurred here in the Columbia Basin for the 4 tribes I work for: the Warm Springs, the Umatilla here in Oregon, the Yakimas in Washington State, and the Nez Perce up in North Idaho. And along the way, actually, I'll get to more of the study here in just a second here, but it's been a real interesting endeavor for me here, because this is one of the most fascinating topics here within my 25 years as a research scientist here. So a little quick word here about our agency, CRITFIC, Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission here. We are the largest Native American Science Center here in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the largest here in the nation dealing with fishery issues here. So we are the technical support agency here for the 4 lower Columbia Treaty tribes here, dealing with salmon recovery issues. We've been around for over 35 years, and we engage very actively with our federal partners, including NIMS, as well as the Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, Bonneville Power Administration here. So this is, go to our website to see what we're doing here. And also we have links to the climatic change articles that are now online. And so, which of course I mentioned to folks here in public that this has been a long work, and a lot of people don't realize this is the first and only special themed issue dealing entirely with climate change and tribes here. There's been a few articles written in recent years, but no specific themed issue until very recently. So it's been quite a joy to see this article published and get some press on it. So I wanted to kind of take us on a journey to the past, the last 100 years. This is really where my research is focused on. My study has been a retrospective study documenting what climate change has already occurred here on the Pacific Northwest basins here. I'll take a look here at present climate change concerns and then 100 years in the future. But let's kind of start here in the past here. So the big thing I was looking at here was assessing how stream flow has changed, since that plays a huge role in terms of salmon habitat and passage, and seeing what specific changes have occurred here. So I used publicly available data here from the USGS for 32 basins. Some of them had no irrigation impacts, some did, and I found a way to naturalize that stream flow data set, which basically is taking a look at the irrigation diversion record that Bonneville Power Administration used in their calculation for the modified adjusted stream flow data set here, since they had access to all the records across Northwest. And essentially I back calculated to calculate the flows without the impacts of irrigation withdrawal here. So I'd have apples to apples comparison with the naturalized data set versus those that were unnaturalized that had no irrigation impact. So the 5 parameters here, which I'll talk more about here in a minute here, I had seasonal flow fraction, the shift in the median annual center flow timing parameter, the spring flow onset, which is really the start of the annual snowmelt cycle. So those first 3 really dealt with actual flow volume. And the last 2 really dealt with the timing as far as the extremes, as far as like high flow versus low flow. The statistical tests that I used here looked at the standard student t-test, and then the Mann-Candel test was really looked for the significance of trend here. And the last item I looked at here was looking here what specific climate change risks were for the lands either above or below 4,000 feet, and I'll get more of that here in a few minutes. But this is based on some earlier work done by Dr. Phil Mote, who formerly was with the SIG, the Climate Impacts Group up in Seattle. He's now down at Oregon State University, but this was some work that he did here earlier. So one big question that people do ask me, since this I think is about the 80th presentation I've given on this topic the last 8 years, is how the heck can you tease out climate change when you've got this incredible, variety of, this natural variability in the system. The graph you're looking at right here is looking at the Columbia River flow down at the Dalles, which has the longest stream flow record we have here in the Pacific Northwest, going back to like the 1870s, so it's really, really long-term record. And each colored dot here represents a particular ENSO condition. So the red dots indicate El Nino years, the blue indicate La Nina years, where it tends to be colder and snowier here during the wintertime. The El Nino years, we tend to have very warm, very dry, very low snowpack years. And the green represents ENSO neutral, so no strong forcing one way or the other. And the black dashed lines there indicate the phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO. So we have the warm phase, the cold phase, the warm phase, the cold phase, spanning here for 20, 30 years at a time. And depending where you draw your start time, you can actually be looking at an increase in warming or a decrease. Same thing for the flow, so where exactly you draw the line. It turns out using statistics, you can't actually tease out the trends. They're not really that strong, but I do have statistical significance in many of the basins, which I'll show you here in a few minutes. But this is kind of a common question I do get, is how can you tease out any particular climate change trend based on this really strong variability? And if you look at the pattern here, without all the colors or the PDO dashed lines here, it almost looks like a very cyclical pattern, which of course it is. With the PDO, it tends to enhance or dampen any particular ENSO year. But again, using statistics, we can actually go forward on that. Looking here at the basin here, the yellow areas are the 4 tribes that I serve here: the Yakimas, Warm Springs, Umatilla, and Nez Perce. The yellow indicates the current reservation boundaries. And you see in very light blue the actual drainage area for the Columbia Basin. So the darker intermediate blue here shows the areas we call the ceded territories. These were the territories that the tribes gave up in exchange for the treaties of 1855 for access to usual and custom places, their traditional foods, which include the salmons, the root, the berries, the traditional game. And so this really comprises about 1/3 of the area of the Pacific Northwest. So this is co-managed with the state agencies as well. So this is no trivial amount of land here. This is pretty significant. We're looking at a big chunk of the Columbia interior here. And just to let you know here, when I start talking about climate change here, if you look at my cursor here for like the Warm Springs Reservation, along the southern boundary here is the Metolius River. I'm going to use the Metolius as an example here in the next few minutes to let you know this really marks the southern boundary here of the Warm Springs Reservation. I'll talk about climate change impacts here in just a minute. So this first parameter here, talking about seasonal flow fraction, so this is really the shift in the flow from the spring, summertime into the autumn, wintertime season. And so I really looked at the summation of the daily flows from April 1st through September 30th and compare that with the October 1st through March 31st flows of that same water year. And so I'm really just looking at how has that volume shifted around over time. So using that Metolius as an example here of climate change were not occurring, the red line would be flat. This slightly sloping line, in this case here, a 3% decline, shows how much of that volume from spring, summer has moved over to a different time this year. In this case here, compared to the annual flow. And the spring, summer is of great interest to the fisheries community because this is the time when the young salmon are emerging from the gravels as fry and then smolts, and then eventually begin their migration out the ocean. And then you have the returning adults also during springtime and summertime years. So that 6-month period is of great interest here to fishery folks here. In this case here, we're seeing a decline in the amount of water going into the autumn wintertime period. Now 3% doesn't sound like much, but the next diagram, which is in my paper, you can see that the actual shift varies wildly here. In this case here, the Metolius Basin here, basin number 3, shows like a little bit of a shift here, but the strongest shifts here we see are up in northeast Oregon as far as the headwaters of the John Day, Umatilla rivers, and the Grand Ronde. We're looking at shifts between 25 to 35% drop compared to 100 years ago. And we're also seeing some pretty rapid change up here in the basin of the Clearwater here, basin number 17 here, which kind of feeds in the lower reaches here, the lower Snake here. And Tim's presentation actually kind of teed this up, so I'll talk about water temperatures here a little bit. But with the warming water temperatures here along the main stem Columbia and Snake here, this is going to probably be providing some thermal blockage as far as salmon returning from the ocean and getting up to their headwaters here. Some of these headwaters are more at risk than others here, but just the basic warming in the lower Columbia will be becoming an increasing problem here, as well as the lower Snake increase in years. So that's the seasonal flow fraction here. So definitely there's been a lot of change, minimal to a lot of change, but there's been change everywhere. There's been no basin unaffected by the change in the seasonal flow fraction as far as having more water migrate from spring, summer into autumn and winter. Now the standard deviation of that is interesting to look at here. This is really a measure of climate and weather variability here. And if the line were flat, it would show no change in that variability. And with the positive sloping line here, what this means is we're seeing more change as far as more extremism in the weather patterns here as we move toward the present. And I've seen this in about roughly 65–70% of all my basins here. We're seeing more extremism within the weather patterns, which is not good if you're trying to manage water resources here for the salmon and everything else. The center of mass of timing. Now, some people ask, how come I just didn't, pick the actual day of the peak flow for that given year? I did that initially in my analysis many years ago, but the problem with that is that if you have like an unusual weather event, like rain on snow or something really goofy like that, you can really skew your analysis. So using other work that's been done, it would suggest that using the center of mass timing by accumulating the daily flows over the course of a water year, and see we're at the median 50th percentile here. So in this case here, the Clearwater shows a good example of that center of timing using the accumulated daily flows over the course of a water year. In this case here, it shows it being right here within, between two peaks right here, but this is the actual probably better measure as far as that center of mass timing as measured by the accumulated daily runoff over the course of a water year. So the question is, how has that meeting point, how has that shifted here over the last 100 years? Well, again, going back to Metolius here, we're seeing a shift about 5 days earlier compared to 100 years ago, which doesn't sound like much, but look at the bigger picture here of the region. It looks like, again, Northeast Oregon is taking the biggest hits here. As far as like the Grand Ronde seeing the greatest shift here, and the headwaters of the John Day and the Umatilla here probably take the next biggest hit, along with other places up here in North Idaho, and now getting here in the Cascades, Washington. Now out here down in the White Salmon and Klickitat basins here within the Columbia River Gorge, they seem to be taking a big hit. So we're looking at shifts between like perhaps maybe like 7 to 18 days, so almost, you know, like 2-3 weeks earlier compared to 100 years ago. A similar parameter here is the spring flow onset, or the start of the snowmelt sequence here. And how this was defined as based upon work from other workers here is that you actually accumulate the daily negative departures of the daily flow relative to like a long-term mean until you get to a certain point here where that accumulated negative departure hits like an absolute minimum, and all of a sudden things turn around and the rivers start to pick up here. And so trying to answer the question, how has that starting time, the snowmelt, how has that changed over time? In this case here, we're going to shift to a different river basin here, the Umatilla River at Gibbon, which is the headwaters of the Umatilla River, not too far away from Pendleton, Oregon. In this case here, we're looking at a shift of 31 days over the course of, you know, even less than 100 years, which has been very dramatic. And one of the reasons why I think there's been such a strong shift in the Umatilla River is that since I visited that basin, there's like a lot of low elevation hills and mountains there. So I think you're really at that sweet point in elevation where you have just a slight increase the warming, you're going to really go from like snow to snow rain transition to perhaps all rain very quickly. So I think because of the local geography there, I think we're seeing the more dramatic effects here. And definitely shows up here on the map as far as being the most dramatic change here. But most basins here are really showing a very strong shift here in the order of like between like 10 to 35 days. So essentially from like 2 to 4 weeks earlier compared to 100 years ago. And that is a real concern because it begs the question, can salmon and other species adapt that rapid change over the last 100 years? Good question. That's still a work in progress. And statistics, just real briefly here, the areas where you see the gray boldface here show the most statistical significance as far as the t-test here, looking at the seasonal flow fraction of the first column here and looking at late century versus early century with the divide line being about 1961. Same thing here for the center of mass of timing and the seasonal flow fraction. So it definitely showed the seasonal flow fraction being kind of showing the greatest amount of statistical significance here across the board. Now switching here toward the high and low flows here. As far as looking at high flow events here, the Skimilkameen River, most of the basins up in British Columbia with a little bit up in the far north central portion of Washington State, near the Okanagan region here. The red dash line here indicates the flood flow level here, and this particular curve with the little triangles, this is like the late century flows, so essentially from like 1962 toward the present. The lower black dot line really from like 1961 to the start of record here. And what we're seeing here as far as like having the higher flows here are actually meeting toward flood flow a lot more often here during the last few years, which is not unexpected here. And so as far as looking here at the 100-year flow, I've actually calculated this here across the October time period, November and December here. And we're seeing the trouble spots as far as increase in the percent of the 100-year flood occurring in northeast Oregon here. But now the North Cascades of Washington are starting to show up here a lot more dramatically. So that's for October. If we jump here to November here, we're seeing a similar pattern. And going to December, so the patterns shift around from some of the basins off and on, but the pattern is pretty similar, going from October, November, December. And again, we're seeing northeast Oregon, many parts of the Clearwater and the salmon, and many of the basins in north central Oregon, as well as the North Cascades of Washington, really are at high risk. So that's sort of good news, bad news. It's good in the fact that you have higher flows that can do some scouring of the gravels to clean out some of the sediment and fines, which salmon really do prefer a good clean habitat. But too much flow basically means you would scour the gravels altogether and destroy all the reds, which basically means you could lose an entire year class down there in those reds if the gravels get completely blown out. And we've actually seen a lot of floods. Give a real quick example of my time with NOAA, with the National Weather Service, when I was at the River Forecast Center. Up until I left in 1998, our duties would be to forecast flood flows the west side of the Cascades, both in Oregon and Washington, during the winter months. The east side would worry about during springtime and summer when snowmelt would occur. During the winter months, we'd rarely have to worry about basins on the east side of the Cascades because they're all frozen down. Since I left in 1998, I've been told my colleagues there at the RFC have been having to do a lot more flood forecasting as far as rain on snow events for the east side of the Cascades during wintertime, which we never had to deal with until 15 years ago. And now this occurs almost every year. So even the real-time operational meteorologists are seeing this change occur right before their eyes. And low flow events here, we've actually seen an increase in the number of low flow events, really more up in Washington State here compared to like Oregon. Not sure why, but definitely we're seeing a lot more lower flow events, which is going to impact the salmon habitat up in Washington State in particular, as well as upper reaches there in North Idaho. One quick thing I want to mention here, looking here as far as there is a relationship here between the elevation of these basins and that shift in timing. And what this pattern is showing you here, that if you're looking here at about this 4,000 feet, which is that elevation that Phil Mote found in the study here, looking at the change of snow water equivalent in the western United States here, that when you get above 4,000 feet here, that you actually see very little change in terms of the timing and other climate change parameters here, because you see less snowmelt going on here. But once you get to 4,000 feet below here, the change is exacerbated, which basically means that basins below 4,000 feet, at least here in the Pacific Northwest, are really going to get hammered. They actually have been the last few years. You've seen with my previous graphs. But Phil Mote's data here basically confirms what a lot of us have been suspecting, that elevations above a certain level are seeing minimal impact. The ones down below are seeing very rapid change, which is unfortunate. And our own in-house study here within CRITFIC here, my colleague David Graves, who's our GIS specialist, looked here at how much of these watersheds are like above and below 4,000 feet. And it turns out that for the Columbia Basin tribes here, that between 50 to 80% of their land is below 4,000 feet, which means those lands in particular are at high risk from climate change because they're below that 4,000 foot threshold marker there, which is unfortunate. So that was the past climate change impacts. Looking real briefly as far as what the current issues that the tribes have here, as far as looking at, besides the warming, we're looking at more extreme variability in the weather here, which means it's harder to predict when those water resources will be available. This year was a perfect example. We had an incredibly dry autumn and midwinter up until about right around Valentine's Day. We had a major snowstorm that started bringing the moisture back, and we've been raining and snowing really since that time for about the last 60 days. And we were getting the initial forecast as far as the water supply in the Columbia Basin was for around between like 40 to 60% of normal. Now we're almost essentially near normal just within the last 60 days. And so we were looking at a really drought-like condition going into really now moist conditions, and we're practically caught up. But going into this here 60 days ago, things looked really bad here for spring, summertime water management here for fish. The other consideration too here is the fact that the reds are popping out of the gravels much sooner because the winter water temperatures are warming up, and unfortunately these little eggs have no choice. If the water gets warmer faster, they'll pop out of the gravels earlier, which begs the question, will be food sources there for the salmon as they're emerging from the gravels, and that's a big consideration. The invasion of warm water species. The Pacific Northwest is the last major area of the country that's not been invaded by these zebra mussels and quagga zebra mussels. I can't remember the name of all the different species, but you folks are probably aware of all the different invasive species that have been slowly contaminating the waterways across the United States. So we're trying to keep these critters out. We're doing a good job here so far, but sooner or later I think some of these critters might be invading the Northwest. So that this is a huge problem, big concern here for fish and wildlife folks here. Looking here at hot water temperatures, this already is having major impact here in the Northwest. Looking here at this next graph here, looking here at seasonal water temperatures, this is average. The blue line down here is looking at springtime temperatures from like April 10th through June 20th. And then the top line here, the red line here on the summertime temperatures going from June 20th to August 31st, which is trying to dovetail in with NOAA Fisheries biological opinion here. Now back in the day here, the actual temperatures were down here in the low side around the low 60s. Salmon start to have problems when you get water temperatures about 68 degrees, and then you've got the temperature lethality around 72. And notice back here, as far as being below 68, that was a common occurrence. As we get here toward the present here, we're above that 68 degree standard here most of the time here. and this is becoming a major problem. And in fact, just the last few years, this is actually impacting the salmon's migratory behavior. This next graph shows the amount of salmon migrating over Bonneville Dam here. The pink line essentially is the long-term average, and for this particular summer of 2003 was a very warm summer. Notice that the counts here, essentially the salmon are hanging down the bottom of the river below Bonneville Dam. It was just way too hot for the salmon to migrate over the fish lines. But once the temperature cooled below 68 degrees here, all of a sudden the salmon were migrating. In this case here, they really were blasting their way over the face of the dam. In fact, we got photographs of this here. We literally had a traffic jam of fish, which we never saw before. And since this time, this basically happens over Bonneville Dam every year. So just in the last 10 years alone, the warming water temperatures have been greatly impacting, altering the migratory behavior of the salmon in ways that we weren't able to predict. So this is becoming a big concern. So looking here toward the future, besides seeing more decrease here as far as the low, in some cases, mid-elevation snowpack here, it's going to get increasingly hard to predict with great accuracy. Our water supply here for spring and summer, which the reservoir operators need to use to manage their reservoirs, which are managing for fish and hydropower and flood control, it's going to be really a moving target. And this year was a prime example of that here. Another consideration, will the lower Columbial water temperatures get so warm that it will be just too hot for the salmon to stay down here? They migrate northward and not come back down to the northwest, which is a big concern. We're seeing a big increased competition of water. It's slowly starting already as far as irrigation water versus salmon water. Looking here at the dead zone impact, we're seeing more increase of these dead zones, especially off the Pacific Northwest coast. Again, more extreme weather. We've talked about that here before. Human health impacts, and this idea about climate refugees. Could people be moving to the Northwest and straining our land and water resources, which are already being pushed as we're having a lot more people move to the Portland, Seattle area? That is a big concern here for local planners. The other major concern area that people are not even talking about here, those folks who remember Dr. James Hansen from NASA, who retired here about a year ago, he actually predicted in some of his earlier work here that we're going to hit this climate change tipping point here if we get beyond 450 parts per million, which based upon past geological studies here show that if we get beyond that 450 threshold here, we'll get beyond a point of unstoppable climate change, which basically means the warming and the extreme weather we've seen here so far will essentially be unstoppable. And his earlier work suggested this could go on perhaps maybe 200 or 300 years from now. And what I've done here in this graph is take a look here at the CO2 readings here from Hawaii and do a best curve fit through here, which I update this every year through September. And my R-square has been consistently 0.99, which basically says if we go through this, hit that tipping point here, my calculations show we'll cross the tipping point threshold in the year 2028, which is 14 years from now. So that does not give us a lot of time to get the emissions here under control. So not a good sign. Some work that Nate Mantua and others here have shown here, specifically here for Washington State, looking at the impact as far as warming water temperatures here on the stressors. Definitely Washington State, as I showed in earlier graphs, is going to be very high on the list here of areas and basins to watch out for. So this is also a bad sign. Also looking here at the change to the Manston River here, we're going to see more of the timing of the water, more of the water being shoved in here during springtime and wintertime, and less during the summertime, which will have a major impact potentially on salmon migrating here during late spring and the summertime months. And people ask you, why are salmon important here to tribes? Well, for one thing, the tribal diets here were very rich in salmon. Some in-house studies suggest that the Northwest tribes here, they had about 50% of their diet totally here on salmon, which is quite high. And for over 100 years, the tribal populations here in the Northwest were in very steep decline here. Within about the last 30 years here, just looking here at the census data, it looks like the tribal populations are bouncing back here, in some cases very strongly here. And so we need that salmon here for the tribal diets. And that's, we need to get there. And so in teaching the young people here about the fishing tradition here, the fishing culture, and just the fact that it's been part of the culture and religion here of the Northwest tribes for a long, long time. And so we need to have more salmon here in order to get back to that way of life as far as continue on that tradition as far as the cultural values here. So kind of one of my last slides here, what can be done? Well, I think we're kind of preaching the choir here as far as looking at flexibility and adaptability. When I gave a similar presentation up here in Victoria, British Columbia here back in 2005. This is something that the Canadians had been dialed into for a long time as far as what sort of flexibility can they do as far as knowing that we can't predict the specific impact of climate change for any given area at any given time. What sort of buffer can we build in here? And besides looking more at green energy options here, also thinking about ways we can absorb excess greenhouse gas emissions. I've seen some actually pretty creative ideas about as far as like building these artificial metallic Christmas trees that are actually encoded with certain specific chemicals that can actually absorb excess carbon dioxide gas out of the air. Also, the tribes are working on watershed restoration projects. There was some work done here, and I think it was like Iowa State University here, which is one of the articles here, as far as looking here at small ponds can actually absorb a lot of excess carbon dioxide gas from just trees alone, which could actually be a real win-win with landowners. So that's one thing to consider here. Reforestation, as far as looking at carbon sequestration, there's actually a project the Nez Perce tribe has been working on here as far as that in regard. Some new really creative ideas have been happening here very recently here. This idea about using ultramafic rocks, which is a very particular, essentially it's a deep rock from the mantle that gets thrust upward here. You see it in some places like Hawaii and elsewhere here. And there was a very new publication in the last 2 years the USGS here has just put out as far as using these ultramafic rocks. And the other thing I learned was that if you heat those rocks up ever so slightly, add some water, the actual absorption capability of these rocks becomes just incredibly great. And essentially, you can think of it as a natural sponge to suck out the excess carbon dioxide gas. What's interesting in this paper here by the USGS, it gives you a map about where are all these ultramafic rocks located here in the United States. The great majority of them are out here in the west, and many are here in like the headwaters, the Umatilla, and the Yakima lines, as well as all throughout the Intermountain West. So this could be a real win-win, both as far as carbon sequestration projects, as well perhaps maybe an economic incentive here for the tribes to get involved. So this is something I would really encourage people to really look at this new USGS paper, because I think it could be a real win-win for the tribes here. Another thing here as far as increasing our basic water forecasting technology, there's been some new tools that have been worked on here the last few years with the climate impact groups and others folks here as far as improving the way we do river forecasting so we have a better conservation of our water resources, doing better management here of water within the reservoirs. And then last but not least here is that some of these climate change scenarios, which really do look very very depressing to say the least, may not perhaps maybe come to pass, perhaps it might be delayed, because all we're doing are these projections, but just going forward here that not everything is inevitable as far as looking here at these scenarios. That I think we're doing a lot of good work on the ground already. I think the tribes are doing a lot of good work already doing rebuilding here a lot of these basins as far as salmon habitat, restoring the streams and so forth, which in itself is natural buffering capability against future climate change, which I think we need to have. Because we, both individually and collectively, can make a difference. If we can make that difference, we can affect change. If we can affect change, we can change the present. And if we can change the present, then we can alter the course of the future. And everyone has to do so if we and our children and everyone else have a future worth having here. And for that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Another really interesting presentation. We have a short time where we can take some questions. If you have a question, please type it into the question box or the chat box. So far, we have received a couple of questions. These are for Dr. Vici. And I don't know if you can see the questions or not. So
yes.
I will okay.
I can. You want me to go ahead and read the questions and then?
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the first question here is how does the assessment, e.g. the ranking of 1 to 4 on sensitivity and then aggregating to low, medium, high, account for crossing thresholds, especially where crossing a threshold increases risk of mortality significantly? The short answer is in the analyses that we did not account for the threshold, particularly in the paper on restoring salmon habitat for a change in climate. And we did that, we chose not to do that very deliberately because, one, we didn't really have high confidence in the absolute temperatures that were coming out of the model, so we know that they can be off by several degrees. And we know that the biological tolerances change depending on where you are on the landscape. So we showed those maps in the paper as indicators of how temperatures would change, but what we suggest for people who are working locally and want to know about how thresholds affect the vulnerability, we suggest that you use your local temperature data and your local biological tolerance information if you have it. If you don't, you can use a literature value for that, but that's going to be a much more reliable number for your absolute values. And then we suggest using the change in temperature from the models as an indication of how much you're going to change in the future. So for example, if your local data says you're at 21 degrees, the model might say you're at 17. And so you don't want to use the model number, you want to use the local number. But the model might say it's going to change by 2 degrees, and that's probably a more reliable number. That's kind of a gut feeling of ours about the data. But that's how we suggest using the threshold idea in these analyses. And then the second question is, how do these assessments account for adaptive capacity? Only sensitivity and exposure were covered. So in the paper on vulnerability, our exposure is composed of 3 components. It has an intensity, a duration, and a timing. And the way we structure the analysis, the timing is our attribute that relates to adaptive capacity. So for example, if we're looking at a change in the timing of flows for spawning, we're looking at how big that change in timing is and then making an assessment of whether we think the steelhead can shift their timing at that same magnitude or at that same pace. And that's kind of it's a pretty loose judgment because there aren't good hard data on how well fish can adapt. So let me point out also that there has been a fair amount of new work within the last 3 or 4 years done on genetic adaptive capacity by Robin Waples, and I'm forgetting the postdoc's name, but there's a few papers out there now where they've used some genetics models to try and look at how quickly salmon can adapt. And then there are also the studies, of course, of transplanting Chinook to New Zealand or other places and seeing how quickly their genetics diverge. And there's pretty good indication that they can adapt pretty quickly. I think what we know the least about is whether, even given their capacity to change and adapt quickly, at some point temperature is probably just going to be too warm and they can't really get there from here. And so we don't really know where those absolute limits are. But I guess the positive thing is that most of the studies that are out there show that there is quite a bit of capacity for genetic change. And then also there's just the phenotypic plasticity. So they can, even without genetic change, for example, change their spawning timing because they're keyed into a flow as opposed to some other variable. So hopefully that answers the questions.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if there are any other questions. I don't see any others. If you have a question, please type it in now.
Sue, this is Christina. We actually, looks like, okay, Tricia received that response. Okay. Was the, let's see, forgive me, I can't, Royan, was your answer or question answered in that? Sue, are you able to see this from Royan Matt?
No,
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. And
Let me see.
Tim, are you? It starts out, my family and I are avid steelhead anglers. Okay, I am getting a few emails, excuse me, a few questions regarding whether or not they're going to be, whether the presentations will be available. I do just want to reiterate the presentation PowerPoint files as well as the recorded versions of the presentation will be available on the Tribal Climate Change website very soon. We just have to work with our IT folks to get it uploaded to the site.
And Christina, I do see some more questions. So there's a question. My family and I are avid anglers on the Salmon River, especially the Frank Church Wilderness River of No Return. We have noticed the current numbers of steelhead decreasing. Is this due to increasing climate changes, or could it be increased commercial fishing at the coast? What are the specific human impacts on the steelhead? So Kyle or Tim?
Yeah, that I don't know that river or population specifically, so I can't give you a specific answer on that.
Yeah, this is Kyle. I'm not aware of anything, but I can make mention, though, that as far as the Salmon River has actually seen the least impact as far as the Nez Perce land. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think they have probably the greatest amount of land above 4,000 feet, so I think they're seeing very, very little climate change, but I've not really seen the steelhead populations up there, so I can't comment on that species in particular.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Christina, do you see any others?
No, actually, Sue, I don't. Sorry about that. No, Sue, I don't. If anybody has any final questions, maybe now would be the time to go ahead and pose them. Otherwise, we will wrap up. All right. I don't see any additional questions at this time.
Okay, well, thank you again, Tim and Kyle, for giving presentations on this webinar. I know there's a lot of interest in fisheries in the Northwest, and the information you provided is really helpful. As Christina said, we will be posting the webinar recording and the presentations on ITEF's Climate Change webinar webpage as soon as possible. And please note the other webinars that we are offering in the series. If you haven't registered already and would like to, please do so. And with that, I think we can say goodbye.
Most welcome. Thank you, ladies. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you both.